all of us have been leading these experiences in our colleges and universities and our colleges around dealing with the social justice issues, dealing with the pandemic of this last year. And we really wanted to make this session kind of a time for reflection, kind of introspection, and some projection about where we're going to go. And let's begin with some of the reflection piece. And I'm going to start with you, William, because I know as the pandemic really took off, one of the things you were the most worried about was making sure that students had the right kinds of financial supports and the kinds of resources they need to be able to weather the storm. And you had some really interesting and sometimes painful findings around folks not being able to even take advantage of what you made available to them. I'd love for you to unpack a bit of that for the folks who are watching.
Sure, Mark, and thank you so much for having me. So what we're seeing is in the state of Texas as a whole, we've seen a reduction in the number of first-time in college students across the community college sector. So you're seeing 50 community colleges in the state of Texas. We traditionally enroll about 750,000 students. And this fall, our first time in college enrollment was down 31%. And what we had done is we had offered about $500,000 more in aid to those students. And what we saw is that they accepted about $4.5 million less. So they went through the process of applying for admissions, applying for financial aid. We made the offer and they just did not enroll. And right now we're offering about 92% of our sections completely online. We still have about 8% of our workforce sections. You can't teach a welder how to weld online. So those courses are still coming in. We're adhering to proper social distancing and PPE, et cetera. But we're really troubled by that first time in college students. So the class of 2020, what we've seen across the community college sector is that they just didn't enroll. We checked with our sister university. They were down about 1 or 2%. We were down, by the way, about 10% this fall. They were down about 1 or 2%, but we also noticed that their first time in college students were down about 400. So between both institutions, we're looking at almost 2,000 first time in college students that would traditionally enroll who have chosen not to enroll. And that's a real concern that we have lost the class of 2020. And so we're moving forward with different initiatives. Project Show Up is a combined initiative to try and get them back for the spring and continuing to move forward.
Yeah, just to double down for a second on that, it's that finding that if a student doesn't take the leap directly from high school into higher education on that first run, especially for low-income first-generation students, they almost never go, right? So is part of this a concern that we've lost an entire group of folks? It's going to be incredibly hard to get back?
It really is. It's a real concern. And we've done, FSG came in and did a study for us and looked at the class of 9, 10, and 11, a 3-year cohort, and looked to see if those students would enroll. And what we noticed is that students that didn't enroll the summer or the fall after high school graduation, the likelihood that they would ever earn a credential was 1%.
Wow.
And so it is a real tragic area where we want to make sure that we don't miss that class of 20. And quite frankly, given the length of the pandemic, we're worried that we may miss the class of 21. So we're putting initiatives in place to reach those students.
Yeah, and Suzanne, this comes back to the idea that it's not just money. Money is definitely an issue. We want to support these students, but really this is about their well-being, right? And I know that for Bennett College, a big part of your core belief, and you jumped into this early, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were the first college in North Carolina to actually say that you were not going to go live in the fall. You actually think, was it in June? You said, no, we're going to go. And you took a lot of grief for that, but people kind of came back around. But you made that decision because you were thinking really about your students' well-being. So talk a little bit about how you came to that conclusion and why you took that step.
Well, we first and foremost, we're looking at our student population. So I think much like William, we start with the student. And we know our students really well. We are historically Black college for women. And we know that a majority of our students come to us with the comorbidities that make them more vulnerable to coronavirus. We also had to decide, are we going to be able to, when there are cases on campus, will we be able to isolate or quarantine? Will we be able to support those students when they're ill on campus? So there's a number of things that go into understanding whether we're ready for students and to manage their health. because that's, we've all kind of become large hospital systems. I mean, in some ways, we're all now part of the public health system in ways that we weren't before. And so with that in mind, with our students' comorbidities in mind, we said we just can't open. We cannot provide in person. We cannot provide that kind of space that's needed and care that's needed at that time. That was a quick turnaround, get ready for the fall. Now we're aiming to get ready for next fall. We're still virtual this semester. We're aiming to get ready for fall 2021, but the direction things are going, I'm not sure, but health and well-being of our students is number one.
Yeah, I know you've kind of adopted some cultural core beliefs around healthy and anti-fragile students. Was that a big part of that conversation? Is the idea of you're trying to help them stay healthy, and then you're also trying to prepare them to be more anti-fragile, right?
Exactly. So one of the things that we talk about is if you're going to be a successful leader in the 21st century, especially a woman of color, a Black woman, you have to be healthy and you have to be anti-fragile both. And anti-fragile is not the same as resilient. Resilient means coming back to status quo. And anti-fragile is, oh, I got knocked over and I get stronger. So those of you who, like me, like comic books and video games, you sort of recognize the superpower, how one sort of builds your superpowers. And so we think it's important to focus on those areas. And so when we talked about what led to that decision was a focus on health and being anti-fragile, our students didn't love it, but they got it because it wasn't a new concept. It wasn't like, oh, now you care about our health. It was something we had been talking about for a while. And I know that a lot of institutions, you had to think about money. Well, yeah, we did, but I'd rather address the healthcare needs first. And if that means some challenging, and they are challenging financial issues, then so be it. But the health and well-being of our students, faculty, and staff is paramount.
And then as we're wrestling with all these pandemic issues, suddenly the social justice issues and the political dynamics of our 2020 election all kind of explode at the same time. And speaking of anti-fragility, right, it is trying to like see how are you going to be able to deal with as an organization these larger challenges. William, talk a bit about the conversations you had, kind of the way you tackled everything from the George Floyd killing all the way through the election. How did you manage that, and what was really important for El Paso Community College?
Sure. So the first thing we had to do was have open conversation about it and acknowledge the tragic events of that horrible day, and really put out a statement, put out where we are, what we're looking at, what we're trying to accomplish, how we're trying to be inclusive. We are a majority minority institution. We have been for years. 85% of our student enrollment is Latino. We continue to be proud in serving that. We're somewhat overrepresented. The county is about 82%. But we wanted to make sure that everyone felt comfortable at our institution. And at the same time, express that we are an institution of higher learning, and therefore we do debate things, but we debate them with civility. And we debate them with an understanding that everyone's opinion matters. But we move forward in that direction. And so that was one of the things that we have continued to move forward with, is expressing ultimately our concern over particular populations and ensuring that people are treated fairly, but also expressing that it is an open institution. We do want to debate these things and moving forward from that perspective.
It just had to be so challenging, coming on the wake of the El Paso Walmart shooting, that combined with the election. I mean, this wasn't something that was happening somewhere else. It was happening in your own backyard. That had to make it pretty concrete and pretty real for your folks.
It sure did. And so what you see is August 3rd of 2019 is a date that will remain in our lexicon for the foreseeable future. That is the date of the Walmart shooting. It took 23 individuals down, injured approximately another 17 plus. It was just a horrible day. And you're right, it just came back to back in our community. After that, then the pandemic, from the pandemic, then we dealt with George Floyd. And it was just somewhat of a culmination of events. And we've tried to do our best to ensure that everyone understands that that is something that we will not tolerate at our institution.
That confronting that conversation and figuring out how you're going to step forward. Suzanne, I'd love for you to talk a bit about, because you put out a pretty powerful poem, like after the George Floyd, talking about how you wanted to talk about it, especially the voice you wanted to bring to it, and the idea that it's you don't want to be just yet another thoughts and prayers voice that's out there. You actually want to, like, what does it make, what is important for you as a leader, for you as an institution? Like, what do you want to say? Talk a bit about, kind of talk about that poem, and then talk also about how it was received, and how you, again, how you could have think about putting that kind of conversation into the mix.
Well, you know, that week of George Floyd was awful, I think, for so many of us, and it was so tragic. But for me, as the president of an institution dedicated to Black women, I also kept wondering, where were the conversations about Black women? And so I had a lot of pressure. Everyone was looking for, where was my tweet? Where was the statement from the college? Where was my Instagram post? You know, immediately, because so many people had statements coming out immediately, really, like, truly immediately, when the protests began. And I just didn't feel like I had anything to add. You know, at that moment in time, there were a lot of people who were saying a lot of things that were far more profound than what I had in mind. And I really wanted to think about my students, our students at Bennett College. And so I wrote a poem called "What Shall I Tell My Students Who Are Black Women?" And it really was sort of me thinking out loud about, what do you say to Black women in this moment, who are out in the streets, who are fighting? The fact that George Floyd called for his mother, it says so much about the weight and the heaviness and the importance of Black women in our communities. And so I really think that the tough thing during these moments is everybody expects you to put out the immediate statement. And I got so much grief for not saying anything. I mean, it took me 5 days. Part of it was I'm processing my own grief. I'm processing my own stuff, and I'm thinking about this responsibility to a group of young women who are themselves out in the streets trying to find their way. I'm not going to rush to just say whatever. I'm not going to say, oh, we see you, we hear you. And what you saw after I was attacked, then you saw days later that the attacks, or the positive statements that people made back to, like, the companies and the people who were putting out their initial statements, you started to see backlash because people realized how easy it was to actually say something on day 1 or day 2. It's a lot harder to sit with the discomfort and the agony and the frustration, and then say, wait, now I have something, and I'm going to say something that adds to the conversation. So I think I continue to watch that. And I think now, at least our alums and our students, our faculty and staff, are getting a bit more used to my rhythm. My rhythm is, I'm not going to jump out just to say something, but I really want it to be something that relates specifically to our students.
Your conversation about being uncomfortable, and about being willing to take a beat and to think about kind of what's going to be said next. Western Governors University, we're 83% women. We're the #1 producer of students of color teaching in the United States right now. We are, one of the things we wanted to make sure we did is we actually talked to educators about, how do you talk about this stuff? How are you going to have conversations?
Yeah.
And so we held a Facebook Live event with Jason Thompson, who's our Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and brought in Mamie Carpenter, who leads a bunch of our DEI work and our DEI courses. And we had just a conversation about how do you approach these dialogues in your educational context? How do you, as a teacher, how do you, as a leader in the education space, be okay entering a conversation and being uncomfortable, not having the perfect thing to say, listening, having to bring a sense of empathy and understanding, and then really being willing to process and understand the lived experiences of other folks. And that was incredibly, I just thought it was so powerful in the dialogues we were able to start with our students, because we have 50,000 alumni in the last 15 years. And just the diversity of those experiences and people coming from all different around the country and how they were processing differently in terms of how they were driving forward. But it really does kind of, in some ways, put an exclamation point on this last year. I mean, from pandemics to social justice to election controversy, we've been leading these institutions that are intending to prepare people for the road ahead. And of course, in this process, we're doing all this introspection and thinking about what we're doing on the road ahead. I'd love for you to talk a little bit, William, about, given the kind of the learning from this last year and the work that you've done, and you're thinking about the coming months and years going forward, what do you think you're bringing forward? What do you think that is going to most important things you're going to bring forward, and how does it have you thinking differently about EPCC, or maybe doubling down on some of the same kind of mission and vision work you were doing before?
So what I'm thinking of is the importance of higher education and how important it is for our community to engage, to participate, to be successful in higher education. And unfortunately, we're seeing the effects of the pandemic directly on that, with first-time in college students being down 31% in the fall, carrying over into the spring. We're seeing enrollment down in the spring as well. And much like Suzanne, we have a plan to go forward in the fall with face-to-face, not at the same level. Before the pandemic, we were 9% of our students were totally online. Another 16% of students took an online course. So 91% of our students were face-to-face. We don't anticipate that we'll ever get back to that level again. So we're looking at trying to go forward in a 60-65% face-to-face, and yet the pandemic is still here. We're trying to move forward and open things up, and yet we're seeing about 500 cases a day. I go back to my data and look back to the end of April into early May. We were averaging 41 cases a day, and we were shut down. And so we've gone where we were averaging nearly 1,600 cases a day, and we've come down, but we're still at a level where it's too high. Trying to get the population to engage in higher education is a really trying piece. We've issued a significant number of devices. We've issued hotspots. We're trying to make sure that we're adhering to our students' needs, and yet we're seeing students choosing not to participate because the aid is out there, and they're choosing not to participate, banking on this passing, and then they'll participate. And so our real concern is, how do we engage that student population? How do we ensure that they participate? We see the depths of the Great Recession from 2008 to right before the pandemic. There's about 12 million new jobs that were created. And of those 12 million new jobs, only 80,000 went to individuals with a high school diploma or less. So over 99% went to individuals with degrees and certificates. So it's so important that we get them to engage, and in particular, the population that we serve, ensuring that they're not only participating, but being successful in higher ed.
So many good points. I mean, just the clarity around how digital equity is a thing. We have to take digital equity seriously in terms of people's being able to access higher education, because higher education is more important than ever before for their going through. But I think one of the most profound things around what you just said, William, is, people are acting as though it's over, right? And tomorrow is a new day. We're at the end of the beginning. We're at the beginning of the middle. Right? We have all this middle work to do right now, which is, and the middle doesn't feel like the middle because there's still, like you said, the cases are as high as they are. We can see now what a path forward is going to look like, but there's work between now and then, between now and the fall, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So Suzanne, I know, just like, last summer when you were processing this and thinking about how you're making your decisions, you're using the decision frame. Okay, now how do we convince students to take the vaccine? Right, has convinced staff to take the vaccine. I mean, given the history in the Black community around, vaccines, it's not a simple conversation to have. And so there's a lot of things you're really wrestling with in this beginning of the middle, and that's your immediate concern, right?
Yeah. I mean, part of what we're trying to think about, again, if health and well-being and anti-fragility are at the center, then we have to start there and say, well, what needs to be in place for the fall? Well, ideally, we would have been talking about vaccines. Part of what we're trying to understand is how many of our students, how many of our faculty and staff are, as they say in the field, vaccine hesitant. And we're going to be surveying to find that out. And it's part of a larger project that we're kicking off, which is focused on building up health literacy amongst Black women. And so we have some pieces to do, which are about education about the vaccine before we can even talk about how are we going to implement protocols related to the vaccine. And so trying to bring that information forward to the community in a way that is, quite frankly, not another roundtable with experts, because our students don't want to watch a roundtable with experts. Like, they appreciate expertise, but they don't want to watch an hour of that. And so trying to think about how do we make the information accessible? How do we have peer educators as part of that? Yeah. We're really leaning into, again, trying to help our students to understand this moment and then educate each other, and thinking about how do we do it in a way that they can receive the information and retain it, because of, again, an hour-long roundtable is not going to work. The other thing that we did this year that I think has been really important is we went from a traditional 16-week semester and we broke it up into 3 mini-mesters. So there's a 2-week session and then 2 7-week sessions. And we did that because really, well, originally I was going to do it whether we were virtual or not, but I wanted to be able to do it because student mental health is critical. And what we saw was students are stopping out or dropping out mid-semester. And sometimes I think that's because they're taking 5 classes for 16 weeks. And the idea that I'm only midway there and I still have more to do is overwhelming. So we switched to this mini-mester format. Students are really responding well to it because you're taking maybe 2 classes at a time. And I think it just gives a better pacing, because
it's a cognitive load issue.
That's exactly
It's a cognitive load issue. There's so many things going on in complicated lives. Managing 2 classes is just a lot easier than trying to manage 5.
That's right. So if you care about health and well-being, if that's what we say, then okay, what does that mean structurally for the college? Right. What does that mean in terms of residence halls and dining halls, and also your course schedule? What all of those things need to come together to really help students, because I really agree. It's been very interesting. I agree that we're losing a generation of students of color in particular from the educational system, but we've been basically flat. Yes, we've lost some students withdrew, but we've really been pretty much flat even since last year. I think some of it is it's a bit more predictable for our students right now. They do appreciate us sharing the data with them, but I think we've been trying to be responsive to a different schedule and a different cognitive load, as you just said.
Yeah, the mental health issue is not a small one. It's I think we've got some deep emotional contagion happening with our staffs, with our students, and I think we've got to figure out how we kind of in some ways muster our resources around that. We at Western Governors University, we've been leaning hard in this idea of leading through these times and preparing ourselves for what's coming next. So we have these cascading beliefs that we can change lives by changing the way people teach and lead, and that we can be catalysts of next generation teaching and leading. But to do that, our students have to experience next generation teaching and leading, and that takes transformational work, and that means a transformational kind of work environment. But think about that's stress, right? That kind of change is stress, and they're already seeing stress in their students, and it spirals. So we've been really intentional about, we have an entire summit around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're really process these things deeply. We had another summit for all of our faculty and staff, which we dove deep into cultural beliefs and what can help us anchor our cultural beliefs. And we're having one coming up in the coming weeks about social emotional learning. And we're doing some deep work, and we're connecting design thinking to social emotional learning with the idea that you want to get to empathy, but then you got to put empathy to work, right? So if you understand your students and have a sense of empathy, how do you design their experiences? How do you design your experiences so that what you're doing can be transformative? And that's this idea of working through. That's where I kind of want to ask you, sir, for just a final thought for folks who are thinking about this moment. They want to meet this moment and be ready for the road ahead. Any advice for leaders and teams who are about to take all this on? I'll go ahead and kick it off with you, Suzanne, first, and then I'll kick it over to William.
Oh my gosh. Well, one of the things that I said to faculty and staff as we kicked off this semester is that I read a great article over the winter break, an HBR article, Harvard Business Review article about leading through the pandemic, basically, and leading through this next wave. So this next wave, or this next phase, what the author said is that the people who will be successful are the people who have psychological stamina. I love that concept, because everybody could rally in the beginning. You're like on adrenaline.
People were
But
talking
now,
as though we were going through a hurricane. Like,
yeah,
we'll get to the other side. No, this is, we're about
right.
to start a marathon, folks.
Yeah,
Right?
I
This
mean,
is
I got my toilet paper and my canned goods. I'm fine. No, we need a bunker worth. Anyway, so I've really been trying to focus on this semester faculty and staff well-being, because we spend a lot of time thinking about students. We still care about students, but as you said, we have to be able to support the folks who are
Yeah.
also supporting our
help
students.
the helpers.
So
Help the helpers.
that's exactly right. So that's a big piece of it. And I think it's interesting that we're part of the Women's College Coalition. I'm on the board. We're taking that on as a topic as a group of women presidents to say, what does it look like to lead through that? And I think you have to have kind of partners, other presidents that you can talk to and say, oh my gosh, this is what we're going through. Are you seeing this? Because I think without that, it's a very, it's almost cliche, but a lot of people say these are very lonely jobs, because you're making very difficult decisions. You have the weight as a leader. You have everybody else's emotional stuff on you. And so where do you turn as a leader, I think, is a critical piece of, yes, we're looking out for our employees. Yes, I prioritize employees, but I'm also looking around to say, okay, and who's in my support network? Because this is hard and it's getting harder, just to be able to help manage all of that.
Yeah, William, what do you think?
So I certainly agree with that. And I'm fortunate to have you, Mark, as a dear colleague and someone I can bounce things off of outside of this, that's outside of the institution. But I certainly, I think that we have no choice. The work is too important. What higher ed brings to the table, it's the surest path to the middle class. It is also the surest path to form a more perfect union. And so when I look at, the past as prologue, I'm always going to bring it back to Shakespeare and my English background. And if we look at the depths of the Great Recession, again, only 80,000 new jobs went to individuals with a high school diploma or less. Over about 11.5 million new jobs went to individuals with degrees and certificates. And we have an obligation to, in particular, who we serve. The populations that we serve are minority populations that need this more than any others, and everyone needs it, but we need to make sure that this population has that fair chance to move forward and move ahead.
Yeah, it's low income first generation students across the board, whether you're in rural Appalachia or in inner city El Paso or inner city Houston. They're people, this is a pathway to opportunity, right? And it's figuring out how we can champion that in a big way. I think, one of the things we're doing with our folks in the SCL Summit is we're talking about these 3 steps for the helpers, right? For those of us who are doing this work, who are trying to be these champions. One is just realize emotional contagion is real, right? This is stress and it's amplifying and it tends to go up and down across the board, right? And one of the first steps is name it to tame it, right? You just have to call it out and say, this is a real thing. And we're going to have to, so there's some inoculation effect in labeling it and realizing, hey, I'm experiencing this and I probably need to take a beat to be able to manage it. Second step is really around this whole notion of preparing yourself, which means getting yourself in the rhythms of self-care, getting in the rhythms of taking time to have the dialogues. And part of that's actually with your institutions. So you can get them in the process of introspection, but also working with each other, connecting with each other, getting those rhythms as well. And the third one is really around this idea of what are you going to do about it? Putting again, that empathy into action. And one of the things that I love, one of our folks was talking about this idea of being and finding and connecting with warm demanders. And warm demanders who are friends and colleagues who are able to give you that hug, but then give you that push. They say, yeah, I understand what's going on, but yeah, William, the work you're doing is so important. You got to keep doing it. And those warm demanders in your life really matter because they will hear you and they'll let you reflect and you can process with them. You can do reflection, introspection, and projection, and they'll hear it, but then they're going to say, you got to get back at it, right? This is that important. And I love that notion of a warm demander and how valuable that is for people who are successful. They have warm demanders in their life. But by the way, you can't become a warm demander until there's a trust relationship, right? They have to trust that you care about them in that way, which means for us to be able to develop that relationship with our teams, they got to trust us. And for our teams to develop that with their students, they got to trust them. But this creates this virtuous cycle of kind of good stuff coming around the other side. Hey, both of you all are warm demanders for me. You push me hard. I love your work. I love being in the education world where you all are leading. So thank you for taking the time to have this dialogue, and thanks to all the South by Southwest EDU folks who joined.